Day 7. Okay, so yesterday we added a mechanism to store our data in a database on our device. We chose Hive as our DB. I want to circle back to that really quick. I did a little bit of research, talked with a friend about ESAR, the other database that I was looking at instead of Hive. I defaulted to Hive because it's what I know, and I wanted to make good use of our time. Looking a little closer at it, ESAR is maybe not the choice that I would default to, and I think I would continue to default to Hive. ESAR is a little more sort of like SQLite. It uses native binaries under the hood. It's not pure Dart. There's a couple of reasons why it doesn't support encryption at rest. A couple different reasons. I just wanted to circle back on that because I did seem a little undecided, and I truly was. I still want to learn ESAR because it seems like a neat tool to have, but thinking more about it, I do think that Hive was probably the right choice for the application that we're building, which is fantastic. Okay, so today we're going to show feedback, or not feedback, the entries for a given quote. So if we load a quote and we have previous entries, we want to find a way to show that. So let's figure out what that looks like. Okay, perfect. Code is up. Can you see? Yes, you can also see the iOS app. Okay, so again, let's start off with how we start off every time. Let's rerun the application and see our new quote for the day. It's nice to just make sure this continues to work. We haven't changed anything that would cause it to break, but we're still kind of testing. I mean, there are 94 quotes, so we're kind of testing that we are getting new quotes every time. There's an interesting dilemma here too, where all of our quotes so far have been Marcus Aurelius related. That's because if we look in the CSV, all the Marcus Aurelius quotes are back to back. So we have a couple different options we can look at for solving that problem. And maybe we'll end up doing that in a future video as well. We're running our tasks, Xcode's building. We need to give this a favicon, so we'll have to figure that out at some point too. Okay, we do have a new quote, which is great. When you rise in the morning, think of what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. Marcus Aurelius, fantastic. Okay, we don't have any items that match this quote, which is even better because that gives us a case to start with. So we're going to start with our quote view model. So we have selecting a quote for a given day, right? And this gives us a quote with a quote ID. And then we're adding a new state called quote view model loaded with our selected quote. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this so that it takes in a list of entry with date time. And we're going to call these entries. And one of the interesting things here is that this property is a list and it's not nullable. So we're not nulling it like this. This is a pattern that I tend to gravitate towards. So we have entries and it's required. If you don't have any entries, just pass in an empty list. I like this because it helps us avoid null checking. And it just seems a little more robust. So that's kind of the pattern we're going to take. So our application's now broke because we don't have entries here. So let's go ahead and solve this, right? Entries, and then we add an empty list. Nothing should change. So if we reload our application, it still works. No errors, nothing has changed yet. Oops. So now we can go into our line 38. So in between 37 and 38, we'll add a new line. And now we need to look up the entries, right? So we have a list of entry with date time. This will be entries. And then we need to figure that out. So we'll get to that in just a second. We can also set entries here because we know that this will be a list of entry with date time, which is what this needs. Excuse me. Okay, and really bad time for a software update. We will delay that. So we need to figure out what this is, right? So we have a way to select these, right? We have it right down here. So we basically need to get our quote entry from our box. So I think what we're gonna do is we're probably gonna pull this out into its own method. So if we go to refactor, oh, not an option. Is it because we started with a comment? Sometimes the refactor tools are a little picky. Yeah, interesting. I think it was because we started with a comment. So we can extract a method, and this is get quote entry for given for quote. We'll just say that. So, okay, we took a little bit too much, right? So we want to do something like this. And this should return the quote. Return quote entry. And then we don't need to keep that around. We can just return this. It may not have a quote entry, so we need to handle that case, right? We might not have one for a given day. That'll be the case that happens the first time a quote comes in circulation, or if a quote comes in circulation and it had come in circulation previously, but we didn't leave feedback for it. Or I keep saying feedback, but a quote entry. Okay, so quote's already defined. Yep, that makes sense. This needs to be something like quote entry instead. And then we still need access to our box. This is a really good, so we're sharing this box across a couple different methods. So this is a really good example of something that we can pull out to the class instance. So we'll go ahead and update that. And then maybe we add this right here on the view model. Oh, we have an error, which is why my formatting didn't work. So this will reformat itself once we fix this piece. So we want get quote selected quote dot. Oh, we need to await this. And we have a couple options. We can wrap this, which is probably what I'm going to do in this case, and await for that, and then do entries with date time. So this could be nullable, so that's something to think about. And we can null check that there, and then do a null coalescence operator, like that. So the way, formatting's a little gross here, but the way that this works is we await for get quote entry for quote. You know what? Let's clean this up. This already feels gross. So I'm creating a new variable here. This will be the quote entries for selected quote. It's a long variable name, but it is what it is. We'll await get quote entry for selected quote, selected quote. Okay, feel much better about that. Then we can come down here and say quote entries for selected quote. Much better. Okay, so a couple different things happen here. Let's talk through them one more time now that this is a little cleaner. We already have a selected quote. We were calculating that previously. We call get quote entry for quote. We pass in that selected quote, and we store that in a variable called quote entries for selected quote. So this is giving us all the entries that we've added. This gives us the entry object, the quote entry object that we've added. And then we want the actual entries, right? And we know this is a list of entry with date time. And that's a property on a quote object. Not a quote object, quote entry. Okay, so the thing here that we need to be aware of, two things. One, this value returns a future quote entry question mark. That question mark means that this is possibly null. So a nullable quote entry. So it's either a quote entry or it's null. Null can be a real pain. Dart gives you a lot of tools for working with null. And one of the practices that I try to do is to get away from null as quickly as possible. So on the next line, we get away from null. So we use this value that can be null. We use question mark dot So this is a null, I'm not sure what the exact name is, but it basically like a null accessor. So this will access this value if this is not null. If it is null, it won't do this, and it'll just return null in its place. So this is basically saying get the entries with date time, unless this value is null, in which case just keep it null. Then we do this operator, the null coalescence operator, I believe. It's not often I use these operators by name. I'll say double question mark because it's generally easier for people to know what I'm talking about, but I am trying to use the right names too. So the double question mark operator, null coalescence in this case, says if the value to the left of these two question marks is null, use the value to the right instead, which is an empty list, right? We talked about that several minutes ago now, but modeling this with an empty list instead of a nullable value. Okay, that should be it. So now we are selecting any entries that match. We're adding this to the quote view model loaded, which is great. Now we need to do a couple different things. So let's do them one at a time. So if we go to our quote view model, we want to add something here in the case of the quote view model loaded where it shows previous quote entries. So maybe we'll do let's do more interaction. This maybe wouldn't be exactly what I would do always. That sounds really weird. This might feel a little weird, but the point that I'm trying to drive home is that we can handle more user interaction here with a button. And what we're going to do is this is going to have a child. It'll be a text, and it'll be review previous journal entries for this quote. That's a really long button, but we'll see how it turns out. We might keep it, we might change it. And then we want to do something on pressed, right? So I'm going to go ahead and hot reload. Okay, that doesn't look as bad as I was expecting. We've got a nice button. We can click it, but we need it to actually do something, right? So we have a couple options. We can use dialogues. We can use another bottom sheet. We could do another view that gives people a list of all of them. We have so many options, and I think what I'm going to pursue for now is a dialog. So we want dialog builder. Oops, dialog. Sorry, show dialog. Been a while. We want to show a general dialog, I believe. Context, page builder. Okay. One thing we need to be aware of, this page builder takes in arguments, it takes in a context and some animation values. I don't really care to animate them, so maybe we just do show dialog instead. And this one's a little different. It takes in a builder with a build context. So let's do that instead. This seems a little simpler and we don't have to worry about animating it. I also don't necessarily want to change the animation, so we can just use what we have. So let's return a container. We'll start there with a child. This child will be a column. This will have children. And what we want to do is, we haven't done anything like this before, so this will be kind of neat. So you can, in lists in Dart, you can inline sorry, got distracted. When lists in Dart, you can inline elements with a, oh my gosh, what is this called? Python is really big about it. Is it list interpolation? It might be list interpolation. But we can say for entry in state. Oh, sorry, snapshot.data dot changing this. Sorry, we have quote defined up here, snapshot.data. Okay, sorry, we'll have to clean up a few things here. So the first thing is I'm going to make a new thing called data, a new variable called data right up here. We're going to point this to data.quote. We're going to point this to data.entries. So this is for, and we need to give this a type. So we know that this is a entry with date time. Okay, now we can add widgets based on this entry. So in our case, we probably want to do something like maybe another column. And then this will have children. And maybe the first one is text with entry, we'll say date time. And this will be entry.date. We'll have to clean that up, I'm sure, but we can get to that in a minute. And then this will be, actually, we probably can just put the entry.text. Okay, this is an unnecessary instance of container. That's fine, we'll leave it for now. We might actually style this depending on how it looks. So let's go ahead and hit this. Null is not a subtype of list entry with date time of function result. Okay. I want to pull up my debug console. I'm going to let this run, see where this happened over here. So this is a stack trace. If you haven't seen one of these before, consider yourself very lucky. Generally, what I do is I try to find what file is highest up the list that is a file that I wrote. So we can see here that data.entries is null, okay? Right, null is not a subtype of list entry with date time of function result. So line 64 and character 55, if you want to get particular, you can actually go in here and type 6455. And it'll take you right to that entry. I'm going to restart our application and make sure I didn't just mess something up with our application state. Okay, I definitely did. That's fine. So I had to restart here because our state changed. This quote view model loaded. These are, this class changed. And to make our application fully aware of that, we needed to restart our application. Okay, so now that we're here, if we click this, nothing really happens. It's kind of interesting. The reason why is because this takes up no size. You might say, well, Brad, there's stuff inside of it. Why does it take up no size? This is an empty list. So these values never get added to this column, which is added to this container. So we have an empty column in this container, which is not taking up any space because containers will scale based on the size of their children, or they can scale off the size of their parents, or you can manually provide a height like this. So let's see how this changes things. Okay, it still doesn't. What if we give this a decoration, and maybe like a box decoration, and try again? Okay, still nothing. But this is kind of interesting. I'm clicking in the middle, and I can't exit the modal. But if I click towards the top, I can. And that's because of the height. So this container does exist. We're getting proof that it exists, right? So what we can do now is maybe a good practice to make sure this does actually render like we would expect is we can say text, it works. Just so we have something on the screen. It's right up there. Okay, that's really not helpful. So what we can do here is we can look at maybe wrapping this in a center and seeing how that changes things. And maybe now's a good time to stress that I'm not a designer. So a lot of times when it comes to widgets and design, what I will do is I will try a couple things, see what works, see what gets me closer to something I like, and then either continue down that path or revert. In this case, I'm going to revert because adding a center there didn't do anything. And part of the reason it didn't do anything is because this is in a column, right? So I say right, there's no reason that you would necessarily know that. But let's remove this column and replace it with text. I did cut this because I'm going to add it back in just a second, but here's dummy text. Okay, so now if I click this, you can see dummy text is right up there. Oh, I can't click out of it now. That's interesting. Okay, so if I undo and add this stuff back, we can change a couple things here. So we can shrink wrap our column, right? Main axis size dot min. Make this as small as possible. Okay. And then we can add main axis alignment. So the main axis is the column axis. So if we set this to center, we should see, I gotta figure out how to close that. Okay, it's now right in the middle of our quote. That's kind of where we want it, towards the center, I would imagine. But let's change this container to a card. And we'll see, okay, cool, that looks much better. It's still really big, so maybe we handle that as well. So we can take a look at some of the options we have here on our card for sizing. You'll notice that we can't give it a height, like that's not an option for a card. You'll also notice that the column, we can give it a size, but we can't really give it anything else, right? Like there's no explicit height. So one thing we can look at is we could wrap this in like a sized box. Again, I'm using code actions here to help me refactor quickly, but we can set this to height, let's say 250, and let's just take a look at how this looks. Okay, it doesn't really look like anything changed, right? So maybe we should pull up the documentation and, okay. Yeah, I was checking right here to make sure that this dialog didn't have constraints for its height. I'm going to try another one really quick just to make sure. So if we do about dialog, what does it need? Oh, list children. Maybe we do an about, well, let's convert this and see what this looks like. And I don't think we would want the card per se. So we'll take this and we will convert this to children. Let's try that. We're missing, there we go. Okay, I kind of like that. I think it's nice that we have close button and this view licenses button that, interesting. Okay, this clearly isn't, provides a button to show licenses for software used by the application. This clearly is not the intended use of that about dialog. So let's revert that to, we'll go back to a show dialog. And let's just start cross-referencing documentation, right? So Flutter dialog. Shows the creation of dialog and dialog full screen widgets. Rather than using this widget directly, consider using an alert dialog or simple dialog. Okay, so maybe we should look at that then. So we have show dialog, there's an example of it, okay. We can find down here, show dialog, and then you can see it wraps it in a dialog. That's what we're missing. So instead of putting this in a card, let's put this in an alert dialog maybe. And this has children, maybe? Widget title, widget content. Okay, so we can give this content like so. Try this again. That looks much better. Okay, perfect. So we have an alert dialog. We have the text that says it works. We have a sized box here. I'm going to remove the height on this sized box and see how it looks if we don't give it an explicit height. Okay, a small thing shows up. I think we do want the height. So let's add that back in and let's change it to 400. That looks pretty good. So now what we can do is now that we're here, we should probably go ahead and add a quote, or add our thoughts on a quote. This is really nice. We're going to add that. We'll hit submit. Now if we hit this, wait, shouldn't we see our quote here? It would make sense, right? So the thing that we're missing is once we submit our quote, we don't load the view state again. So we'll trigger a reload of the view state, but to prove that's the issue, if we do a hard restart of our application, it should load the view state. There it is. Okay, this looks weird. We'll format that in a minute, but for now, we just wanted to see our previous thoughts on that quote. So now that we're here, what we need to do is in our quote view model submit entry, we need to reload our state. So we have a couple options. I think what I would probably recommend at this point is just calling load quotes. And the reason why I like this pattern is because if any of the logic in load quotes changes, we just trigger it again. We probably don't need to reload this, and we could technically cache this value in memory like really quickly from the previous state and put it in the new state. And there's like a lot of micro optimizations we can make here. But in the spirit of keeping it simple, we're just going to call load quotes. We will also, I don't necessarily know if we need to await that. Let's try not awaiting it for now and see how that looks. So we're here. I'm going to add one, say this is entry number 2. Okay, journal entry saved. Now if we hit this button, oh, we still don't see it. Why is that? So we call load quotes. Is it because did our view model change and I need to restart the application? Now we get to troubleshoot. Okay, there's entry 2, that's good. So let's type one, entry number 3. Journal entry saved. This is entry 2. I'm curious if what we're running into is a scenario where we do need to await this because the entries to the quotes aren't being persisted to the box because we're not awaiting this put. Yep, that will definitely do it. Let's await these puts. So currently we were triggering the put, which is an asynchronous operation, and we weren't waiting for it to respond. Maybe not the best thing that we could have done. And now that we call load quotes, it will trigger. Let's not await load quotes. Let's try this really quick. So now that we're awaiting this put, we're updating the values in the box. And then once those values succeed in updating, or you know, they can fail too. But once they do succeed, we trigger load quote, and then we return. So now that we're here, let's do quote number 4. Submit. Okay. There it is. Perfect. So this returns a feature too, so why don't we need to await this? That's a really great question. So the reason we don't need to await this is because we don't care we don't have logic after this that depends on this being completed. We loading quotes and getting the most up-to-date data depends on the data being saved. So we need to await the puts in that box because that's how we save that data. Once we have done those puts, though, we don't necessarily need to await this. In fact, if we do await this, what happens is we don't return until this completes, and the consequences of that are defined in our view. So in our case, we can't pop the navigation away, so can't pop the bottom sheet out of the user's view, and we can't show the snack bar until that completes. We don't necessarily need to reload the new items before we do those things, so we won't await our load quote call here on line 76. Okay, and I just made a small change. I'm trying to be better about that, but making a small change while I'm talking that isn't relevant to the thing I'm talking about I just added a comma here and a comma here so that Dart would format these better. You don't have to do this. It might be helpful, but yeah, just commas right there. Okay, so we have our previous entries. This looks a little weird, right? So let's make it look a little less weird. So now that we are here, we can remove the "it works" text because that is irrelevant. Open it again, we don't see the "it works" text. So this is the interesting thing. That date time is it's valid, but it's not pretty. So let's see what we can do. Let's cross-reference the documentation again. Flutter date format. Okay, so there is a date format for formatting and parsing dates in a locale-sensitive manner. This is what we want, or this is maybe what we want. I like this, year, month, day, but there are a lot of different formats. So what we're gonna do is we'll click on INTL, which is the library that provides this stuff, this functionality. Stuff isn't very helpful. And then I don't remember. Okay, so I think this does come as a part of Flutter. So let's try import package Flutter INTL. No. Okay, maybe it doesn't ship as part of Flutter. Flutter INTL. Sorry, it's been a little while. Okay. Flutter pub add INTL any. Cool. So we will take this and we'll just add it to our pub spec. We'll start there. So we have our pub spec YAML. We're going to add a dependency to INTL. Oops. The documentation points you to any. I'm not huge on this. I'd like to actually have a specific version. I'm gonna activate a plugin called Version Lens and see. Okay, so the latest is 0.19.0. So I'm gonna set mine to 0.19.0, and I'm gonna turn Version Lens off. That's a really nice plugin that just shows you the latest versions of dependencies in your pub spec or your package.json or other files. Okay, so now that we're here, Flutter localizations, add your own localized messages. Okay. I really don't care about generated stuff, and I really just want an example of date, time, messages with dates. Okay, let's just explore and see if we can figure it out then. So we know it's a package called intl/intl.dart. That should be a good starting place at least. Okay, so we import this internationalization package. In our quote view state, we can define a formatter. So date formatter equals date format. Okay, perfect. And then we have all these options. So in our case, I like the idea of, let's do, I wish I had an example of these. Okay, maybe we can find an example here. So INTL, date, maybe, date format, year, month, day. That's fine, let's do that. Date format.ymd. You can provide a locale. I think it will try to look up the locale if you don't provide one. Could be wrong on that. And now we can take this date formatter instance that we have, and then we can, down here where we have entry date, we can call date formatter.format and then pass in the entry date. Now that we're here, if we hit review previous, we can see date time 12/7/2023. Pretty good. It is not super pretty, but we can change that really quick too. So we have a column, and we have a column inside that column. So what we're going to do is go to the outermost column, and we will set a cross-axis alignment equal to start. Okay, that slides us over to the left some. Now we need to set a cross-axis alignment in the child column equal to start as well. Okay, that looks better. And then maybe what we want to do is add some spacing. So we could either wrap some of this in padding, like we could wrap this column in padding. And I think that's probably the approach that I'll take here. You could add a sized box. You have a lot of options. So in our case, we're going to add padding only bottom, and then I'm thinking 24. Just an arbitrary number. We'll see how it looks. That looks pretty good. One thing we haven't talked about, though, is what happens if we have a lot of text. So I'm going to go open up a browser and go to lorem ipsum generator, and we'll go to lorem ipsum io. Lorem ipsum is just Latin placeholder text. So I want, 5 paragraphs. Great. This is, okay, maybe 5 paragraphs is more than reasonable in our case, but we can paste this, allow paste, submit. Review. Oh no, all sorts of issues. So our bottom overflowed and much more. You can see it leaking out of our, oh my gosh, what is this called? Container, our dialog. And that's definitely an issue of something we'll need to fix. I'm going to remove this main axis size min, reload, and then trigger this again. Okay. As I expected, not much change. We don't need that main axis size min on the parent column in our dialog. So what we will need to do is we need to make sure that our text stays within our column and that our column is scrollable. And I think we'll pick up tomorrow and work on that. But there's one last thing I want to do really quick, and that is format our text so it's a little different. So in our date time, I'm going to add a style, and I'm going to add text style. I want bold. I'm trying to remember font weight is what that's called. Font weight dot bold. And now if we load this again, our date times are bold. They kind of are nice little headings. And that seems like a good thing to start with. So our application's in a broken state. It feels kind of weird leaving it in a broken state, but we will tackle this tomorrow. And that gives us a fun little thing to think about in the meantime. Okay, so we are showing our list entries now. We're almost at the point where we have like a fully functioning application. Don't get me wrong, we've got some debugging to do and some troubleshooting. We don't have an icon. We don't have push notifications. I feel like we need push notifications. So we'll have some notifications that trigger daily to get you to reflect on your thought. Maybe it will even have the quote in it too, or a teaser for the quote in it. It's something we can kind of explore and see what feels right for our application. I think that's probably about it for today. So if you found this video helpful, I would appreciate it if you haven't already, if you want to subscribe to the channel. And then if you want to like that video, let me know your thoughts below. Is this one kind of working? What are your thoughts on the series so far? I haven't really asked for feedback yet, so now seems like a good time to do it now that we're 6 days in. All right, thanks and enjoy your Thursday.